It's 1:30, so let's make a start to the meeting. Welcome everybody to the meeting of the Norfolk and Waveney CCG governing body, which we're holding as best we can in the current environment in public. So we're live streaming, so just be mindful of that. As Melanie just said, use the chat box to communicate if you want to make yourselves heard. Although at the moment I can see everybody, so if you do wave frantically, I probably will see you as well. So have we? We're planning to have this section of the meeting finish around 3:30. So I think people will need to 3:45. So people will need to kind of be sort of quite strict with the timings because we've got quite a lot on the agenda to get through today. So can I ask you to keep to your times if you can? Otherwise, I'll prompt you. I haven't had any actions to take since we last met under Chair's action. So item 2, apologies for absence. Have we got any apologies, Jane or Melanie?
No, we're not aware of any apologies, Chair. Okay,
and I think it does look as if we're got pretty full attendance, which I think is one of the advantages of the current pandemic, is that attendance at these sorts of meetings has been pretty good. One of the few advantages I should hasten to add. So item 3 is declarations of interest. You should be obviously mindful that to keep the register of interests up to date. If during the meeting there are any items that we're discussing where you feel that there may be a potential or actual conflict of interest, please can you make me aware at the time. But are there any conflicts of interest that people want to declare in terms of the agenda items today? No? Okay, thank you. So item 4 is the minutes of the last meeting which we held. We need to first of all approve. So that was held on the 28th of July. Let me just get that onto a different screen. There we go. So any matters of accuracy on those minutes or matters arising? I mean, do I need to go through each page, or I'll take it as a whole? Are there any accuracy items, first of all? Claire?
I had just 2, please, Chair. At the bottom of page 2, there perhaps just needs a little bit of clarification around the wording. So that was with regard to some of the areas highlighted within the reports that I referenced. There are minor amendments there. So that's around, there's a comment about behavioural characteristics, which was suggested as a possible cause, but without evidence. Actually, I think it states with evidence.
With evidence.
So it should read, but in fact, there's no evidence of that. On page 3, it should reference type 2 diabetes, know your risk, and access to the NDPP. So just some minor inaccuracies on that. I'm happy to ensure that those are correct.
Okay, so if you could just check with Jane, and we'll get those amendments correct and corrections. Anybody else with any matters of accuracy? No. Okay, so we'll with those amendments, we'll approve the minutes. And are there any matters arising from the last meeting which we're not covering on the agenda today? Doris, did you want to come in? No, I know you said about freedom to speak, Guardian. Do you want to make your?
Yes, I can.
Because we discussed that at the last meeting, didn't we? And you're our champion, or Guardian, I should say.
I just want to take the opportunity to bring to the governing body's attention October is Freedom to Speak. there is a campaign going on. The CCG will also be running a campaign to highlight the month and encourage staff to take part. So that's all I want to say, really. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that, Doris. And I don't know about others, but I'm getting quite a bit of feedback. So if people can just be mindful that if they're not speaking, can they mute their microphones? Because it's often just one person if they've got the microphone on, it sort of causes like a feedback loop. So if you can mute your microphones, please. Thank you. So we're on to the action log. Let me just get it up. Yeah, so there's just 2 items on there. So any updates on those? So it's once for November. Okay, so I think those are in progress, aren't they? So there's no action that's required.
Yes,
There's
Chair,
still a lot of feedback.
Chair, I was just going to say both those actions are in progress and they have been updated before sending out with the papers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's. So we'll move on to the Chief Officer update and Melanie's report. So Melanie, over to you for next item.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm just going to pull out from my report just some key points I wanted to emphasise, and much of what I've put in the report is covered in papers over the course of the agenda. And it seems like 2 weeks ago when we wrote the report, a lot has moved on. And of course, we're now seeing much higher numbers of infections across the country, albeit at a slower rate in Norfolk. And so this is very much in our minds at the moment about how we move forward to support the NHS, both manage the increase in infections of COVID-19 that we are seeing, as well as manage all the businesses as usual. And the key theme in all of that, I think, is about how do we do all that we can to continue to value and support our staff in the NHS and health and care sector, and how we reach out to ensure that even those from all parts of Norfolk and Waveney, including those from the most disadvantaged groups, are supported to effectively engage with our services. So I wanted to draw attention to the We Care Together People Plan, which has been published recently, and this reflects the NHS People Plan. Very important that we work on this to support and value our staff. And the Norfolk and Waveney People Board holds its first meeting in October, which I will be delighted to attend. And I would encourage colleagues to read the We Care Together plan very carefully, which has been the product of a long piece of work involving high numbers of staff from across the sector. And I also wanted to mention as well general practice and all of their staff, and really to commend the work that the general practices all undertake in Norfolk and Waveney. Our local population are supported with a number of different ways of accessing general practice, and I'm truly thankful for the incredible efforts of general practices, including all of their staff, that we saw at the start of COVID, the flexibility that practices are now showing, and the ways that they're continuing to adapt to work. And it's very important that we, and that I certainly really truly value their commitment. So those were the only two areas of the report that I wanted to specifically mention, Chair, but happy to comment on anything else if there are questions.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. So any questions for Melanie or any comments on her report? No? Okay, thank you. Just checking the chat box.
Anoop, I think Doris wanted to come in.
Okay.
I just wondered, Melanie, in your report, you talked about testing, whether there's been any progress since you wrote the report in terms of funding and staffing.
Thank you, Doris, for that. The service continues to see incredible demand, very much from the return to schools particularly, but also all of those people connected, either parents with children, teachers and so forth. This has really led to an increase on both our local service and our national service. We do expect the situation to improve, but at this stage, whilst we received our funding settlement a couple of weeks ago now, which included clarification around the funding for testing. I think it's fair to say it was better than we were expecting, which is very positive. But nevertheless, what we really need to be able to do is to secure a more longer term provision for a local testing service. Many of our staff who are running the local services using our local NHS capacity have been effectively borrowed from other parts of the NHS and health and care sector, and those staff are having to return to their day jobs as we try to manage everything else. So at this stage, we are in discussions with the Department of Health and Social Care about a stronger offer, but there is nothing more to report on that at present.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any comments or questions? Yeah, Tracy?
Yes, I was just going to make a comment in respect of the addressing health inequalities, an example that Melanie has talked about in her report from the Banham Poultry outbreak, and sort of engaging with some of our migrant workers where English is not their first language. So thinking about moving on to now what's going to be, I think, a very difficult winter, and just drawing on kind of the support and engaging primary care and how we support some of those more difficult and hard to reach groups, particularly when we will have people self-isolating, we will have that economic effect of people not able to work. So it's just, you know, how we can engage our primary care in with those other schemes that are happening across through with our district councils and the county council as well, because I think we will come across people that are you know, in hardship during these times. So just something for me to point out, really.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? No? Okay, thank you. Thanks for that report, Melanie. So let's move to item 7, which is the report which Mark and Chris are going to give us on people's experiences during COVID-19. Mark, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anoop. Just a couple of points by way of introduction from me before I hand over to Chris. This is the result of some research into people's experience of health and care services during the COVID-19 epidemic, undertaken in and around July. I think with hindsight, that seems a particularly good point at which to have undertaken the research, and it's qualitative research, and therefore gives some very helpful pointers to us. First, in terms of how we might change our approach to commissioning of services during the continuation of the pandemic. But I think more importantly, it also helps to inform what permanent changes we might look to make to the delivery of healthcare in the light of the research. A good example being, I think, some element of surprise as to how willing people were to travel to a hospital which is not the one closest to them for their treatment. So whilst there might not have been any major surprises in what we've seen, there are some very useful pointers nonetheless. But let me now hand over to Chris, if I may, and he can take us through the research itself.
Good afternoon. I will keep this relatively brief so we've got time for a good discussion. But as Mark points out, we chose focus groups and interviews for a very good reason. That kind of depth and richness that you don't get from other research methodologies, surveys, for example. They help us understand people's experiences, attitudes, motivations, and they give us an opportunity to kind of probe people's responses. Britain Thinks identified 5 key findings, and I think, as Mark said, to some degree, they aren't hugely surprising. There were areas where we suspected people might hold one point of view, and this has helped us to give us some evidence to back that up. So, for example, it talks about people's experiences of remote appointments, and I think we thought that people were generally liking the use of footfall and video and telephone appointments. This gives us some research to actually say, now we know that is not true. So in terms of the key findings, Britain Thinks identified 5. The first was around participants' experience of COVID during the pandemic, and as they rightly point out, the responses were very mixed. Many people were able to describe real positives, more time with their family, but even those who had generally felt quite positive experience, even they had difficult moments. And also some people during the research talked about really difficult times. Our main thrust was to understand people's experiences of services, and by and large, people thought that the local NHS performed very well given the pressures that they were under. Most of the participants didn't have direct experience of social care, so their views on social care tended to be informed by the media, but they did have more variable views on social care and its performance, which I think if we reflect on our own experiences of the pandemic, we would look back and think our care homes actually performed pretty well, but that wasn't what people told us. So that's interesting. Many parties engaged with services though since the outbreak and reported positive experiences, and as I said already, they enjoyed the online and telephone appointments. They felt they were helped to ease access issues, particularly, for example, those of working age, because they meant that they could just have a quick 10-minute telephone appointment rather than need to leave work, drive to their GP surgery for a 10-minute appointment and then go back to work. It felt much easier. Also, parents of young children said that they found the whole process better, although there were some concerns around those who might be digitally excluded. And I know we've done work around that. Again, the picture of what people thought of social care was again more mixed, with some people describing quite severe disruption to the services they were receiving. We did ask participants about some ways which we might change how services are delivered in future. Generally, people were quite supportive of us prioritising urgent and cancer care. As Mark said, we asked them about travelling or getting help from different hospitals, surgery, and again, quite well received. 111, this was before 111 first was a national policy. We asked them a few questions about their experiences of 111. People's experiences were a bit mixed, but they generally welcome the idea of being able to have quicker access to a GP or a nurse over the phone. There was some concern about the requirement to self-isolate for 14 days before attending routine or non-urgent care. As well as asking people about people's experiences of their care right now, we did ask them to think a bit about the future. We asked them about the Health and Care Partnership's 3 goals, and generally these were felt to be pretty cohesive and comprehensive. But in addition to that, people said that they also would want us to focus on as a partnership is mental health conditions and social care. In terms of mental health, this wasn't driven by people's thoughts or experiences, particularly of the local mental health services. This was a reflection partly of people's experience of the pandemic and a recognition that we're going to need to support people with their mental health and well-being, but also just a trend over the past 6, 7, 8 years of a greater awareness of mental health and parity of esteem. So those were kind of the key findings. I won't go on at length. I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read the report, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, great, thank you. So open it up for discussion, comments and questions. Yep, Hilary?
Hi, thanks for that. That's really interesting. I suppose what struck me was how it kind of told us to a great extent what we might have thought. And I wondered really whether we looked at the other information that was out there as well. Have we looked at things, for example, like the Health Watch report? I think they did quite a big piece of work, didn't they, around July time? So I wondered whether we were kind of triangulating the information from this, which was more maybe in depth and small numbers, with the other information that's out there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we are doing just that. Unfortunately, the timescales didn't quite align. We had originally hoped to bring a combined report to governing body, which looked at the work of Britain Thinks, the work of both of our health watches, and you're right, they've both done some surveys, and also the work of our CCG engagement colleagues who've been out talking to some of the particular groups. So they've been talking to maternity voice partnerships about people's experiences of maternity care during the pandemic, etc., etc. Didn't quite work out, but we are still writing that report, and we will share it with governing body so you can see it. In terms of triangulating this work with Health Watch, which we have done that work already, it's actually pretty similar. What came out more strongly in the Health Watch reports was around access to dental care, which didn't particularly come through in ours, but was a concern raised during those. But yes, it's a good point, and we are.
Okay, Arden?
Thank you. Thanks, Anoop. It was encouraging that most of the participants were actively looking after their and their families' mental health, which was very pleasing. But it was slightly disappointing that there was no reference made to some of the services that have been made available throughout the last few months to facilitate that, such as online counselling and the additional work that IAPT have been doing. So perhaps there's a lesson in that perhaps needs to be a bit shared more widely across our system so that people are more aware of those resources.
I think that's probably the way in which we structured the questions and the people that we were aiming to talk to. Some of the participants had some experience with mental health services, particularly some of those who we conducted the in-depth interviews with. But by and large, to the best of our knowledge, the participants didn't. But we can do more targeted work with those who have used those services to find out what people's experience has been like.
Okay, Tracy?
Yeah, I think mine really sort of goes on from what Hilary and Arden has said as well. It's just some communities out there that perhaps we're not reaching, and to understand what their kind of experiences are. So I just think there might be groups particularly that we are missing. And I know, Chris, you've said there's some work that is looking towards that, particularly thinking about, people that don't have access to online materials and various things as well, and how we're engaging with those. I think from my own surgery, which is in quite a deprived area of Norwich, it's dawning on us that there's a few people that we just haven't seen for some time, and we're considering how we're going to kind of make contact with those people and be proactive in that respect. And the other aspect to me is about children and young people, because this is an over 18 service. So I think there probably has been some work done with kind of our children and more younger cohorts as well, and those families. So just a question about that too, Chris.
I'll take that last point first. In terms of children and young people, we are talking to some of the youth advisory boards, for example, and I think Norwich might be today or yesterday, and Ollie Crookshank from the engagement team is there. So we are trying to seek the views from children and young people to some extent, and also help with that by partners. So I think the county councils have been helping facilitate some of that as well. So we'll come back to you with some results of what they've told us. We've had a few bits and pieces. One I thought that was interesting was around telephone appointments, and young people saying, it's difficult, I live at home, so if I want to have a private appointment on the phone, I need to be able to find a quiet space, and that's not always easy. So yes, we'll have more feedback around that. And again, I think if there are communities who you think we need to be going out and talking to, we have a an engagement team who are very experienced, and we can target them to go and speak to some of those communities. I haven't got the full list off the top of my head, but they've done some quite interesting work with people with learning disabilities, and we can share the findings. They've done some interesting. I think they're trying to do more work around BAME, obviously, because the community has been more affected by COVID. So we will share more of this, but yeah, if you've got other groups you think we should be talking to, then by all means, we'd be very happy to have a conversation about it.
Okay, Kath?
Thank you. I just wanted to raise a couple of areas, if I could. So I think it would be really interesting for us to, in partnership with our local authority colleagues, look at the impact on family carers as a result of the way in which people have been either isolated, fearful of accessing paid social care, and also due to the closure of daycare during wave one. And I think that has put immense pressure on families, and we need to be mindful of that when we're looking towards our winter and potentially a resurgence of COVID during the winter. And the other group I'd like to raise is about child family carers. So they are often the very forgotten group of people, children and young people who are looking after family members unpaid and unsupported. And I think that's a really important area that we need to look at, how we are understanding how they are being supported, if at all they are, and what as a health and care partnership we could be doing to support them.
Thanks, Kath. I know that Healthwatch Norfolk produced a separate version of their report, which was just about the experiences of care, adult carers in this particular instance. I've also seen a draft report from Norfolk County Council about some of the work that they've done to understand people's experiences of adult social care in greater depth, because whilst they were involved in this particular piece of research, most of it wasn't with people who have direct experience of people who use social care. So they have done some other work as well, and so we can share that. In terms of young carers, that's a really interesting point. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure whether we've been spoken to them yet, but we can certainly look into that. In previous roles on other projects, I have gone out and spoken to young carers, and as you say, it's a group we should not forget.
Okay. Kathy?
Thank you. Thank you for this report. I thought it was really interesting reading. The part on social care I thought was really interesting, that people had got a lot of their views from the media. The one thing that I was surprised wasn't there was how we have coped with managing people who are dying, not necessarily from COVID, but dying from long-term conditions. And I think that's impacted on families enormously because of not being able to access and visit their loved ones, until right towards the end. And I think that's been an issue across healthcare as well as social care. And I think in some cases it's meant people haven't gone into a care setting because it means that the family can't visit them. And I know both from personal experience and also from what's been on the news that this has been a cause of great distress for families and relatives. And I just wondered if there was more that we could do, bearing in mind that we're going into winter, a time when there is more activity, but also a need to make sure that people who are at the end of their life get some support from their family and relatives.
Right, it's not covered by the report, and it wasn't something that we chose to focus on when we wrote the research brief. And I don't know whether some of the providers of those services have done any work to understand people's experiences. Have got in touch with all the trusts, patient experience leads to try and get from them some feedback. So it would be interesting to see whether the likes of NCH and C have done any work around this. But leave it with me. I'll have a look into it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Chris? Okay. So we're asked to keep the findings in mind when we make decisions and in our strategic planning. And I think a number of the comments have been around which services perhaps haven't been looked at, or groups which haven't been consulted, which I think is really important. But if we turn that round, if we're going to use the information that we've got from this report in our decision making and in our planning, what are the decisions that we need to make in this what in the winter is likely to be a further increase in numbers of COVID. What are there any key messages that we have learned from this piece of work which should inform our decision making in the coming months?
Sorry, Manny, I wasn't sure if you were going to answer that. Are you going to answer, Manny?
I was going to start, if that's okay, Chris, but is that okay? I'll just start and maybe you want to carry on. I mean, I think my reflection on the first wave is that for all the reasons that we know and understand, and the speed and the all that we didn't know back then, meant that we formed one approach, largely one approach to looking after people. And it was a blanket approach, and that worked for a number of people, but we now understand and know that it didn't work for a number of people. And so I think we need now, going into this next phase, a more differential approach, which is what we're talking about, not assuming that everybody can engage with digital access, because we know that that's not convenient for all the reasons that Chris has outlined. But having more differential approaches to meet the needs of different communities is, for me, the key thing in this next phase.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. And I think there's no point in having this sort of report and not using the information and what it tells us. I think, and I would agree with that absolutely. And I think also that the focus isn't. We now know a lot more about COVID and what it is and what it isn't. And to be mindful that there is a consequence when services for patients who are isolated, got long-term conditions, got mental health disorders, that actually those are made a lot worse by the exclusion caused by not being able to access services. So I think we do need to be mindful of that going forward. So can I thank Chris for giving us that report. Mark, was there anything you wanted to say in conclusion?
I don't think so, really. Thank you, Andrew. I mean, clearly, one thing we need to bear in mind is that opinions are likely to be changing quite quickly. And as Hilary reminded us, this is just one piece of research amongst many others. And doubtless we shall see other themes coming through from future research. But I think it is useful for future priorities, as everyone has said, planning future priorities.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for that. Let's move on to item 8, which is Kath. You're going to give us an update on recovery and planning.
Thank you. There is a slides set. Is that going to be displayed?
Jane is just putting that up, hopefully.
Lovely. Thank you. For the purposes, it's a large slide deck, so I don't propose to go through every single slide. It's there for some information, but also to generate discussion or any questions. So as it's coming up on the screen, lovely. I can see it. Can everyone else see it? If we can go through to slide 2, please, Jane. Thank you. And so just to say the numbers of deaths, the number of cases in Norfolk are set out on the slide, and both for Norfolk and Suffolk, which is on the following slides, what we will see is that the numbers of confirmed cases in both counties are significantly lower than the regional and national rates. If you can move on to the next slide, please, and the slide after. There's some information for governing body setting out the learning from the outbreak from Banham Poultry, and you can see there were 127 positive cases. Lots of learning. We were recognised as a system at the NHS England national gold call about how Norfolk as a county, as a system, responded to the outbreak in a really rapid pace, although there is still some learning to be had. Testing was delivered by a combination of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 testing, and recognition of the real rapid response from both EC and NCH&C in supporting that, along with other partners across the healthcare system and other key services. What was of note is many of the staff who worked in this environment from Eastern Europe live in houses of multiple occupancy, and some were agency workers. So recognising Tracy's comment earlier, it's really important that we understand the impact of people not being able to work, and the penultimate bullet point on this slide makes reference to the Norfolk Assistance Scheme, which was initiated in order for people to access food and medical supplies as needed. Next slide, please. The following couple of slides provide some information on registered deaths. And if you could move to slide 10 and 9, please, Jane. Excuse me, my voice is just all of a sudden gone. This slide just sets out the fact that the number of emergency admissions to hospital with COVID has reduced significantly. Very low numbers at the moment. But one thing to say in the narrative at the bottom of that slide is to inform governing body that we're at pre-pandemic levels with regard to non-elective admissions to hospital and ED attendances. Next slide, please. In terms of national testing, I won't repeat everything that was mentioned earlier on, but it is just to reinforce and recognise that our local testing system has been affected by the real challenges within the national testing service, and the increase in demand that's been put upon the national testing service, which has been pressured by the return of children to schools, international travel, and lab outbreaks in other parts of the country. And I think it's important to say that the challenges and the pressures with the testing system hasn't been about the ability to take the swabs, it's been about laboratory capacity, which has been the problem. And there is additional national lighthouse lab capacity coming online. There's also other pieces of work underway looking at rapid testing solutions, and we'll await information on that from the national system. We have no information at the moment as to when we might access that type of testing technology. Next slide, please, Jane. As I say, our local testing provision, it continues, but it's been really pressured as a result of what I've just described. And our community testing teams, remain providing an excellent service, and EC have responded to another industrial outbreak over the weekend, and are providing a really responsive collegiate service to our population. We recognise in relation to some children in schools where their families may not be able to access drive-through services or the usual testing routes, particularly in schools in deprived areas, recognising some poverty and deprivation challenges. So small numbers of kits have been deployed to schools so that if children need to be tested, then they don't have to go and try and find a way to get to one of the usual testing routes. And by the end of October, where we should have point of care testing available in the 3 emergency departments, which would be able to provide results within 90 minutes. Next slide, please. So in terms of a big area of focus now in relation to our COVID response, we were only able to prioritise emergency, urgent and emergency care during wave 1. And so a big part of our recovery programme relates to restoring elective and cancer care. So I'm just going to pick out some key parts within these slides, if that's okay. So on this slide, you'll see the main barriers that relating to getting back to pre-COVID levels of activity, relate to challenges such as workforce, the need to remain to social distance, patients requiring isolation, particularly before they access services, and the enhanced infection control measures that need to be carried out, such as additional PPE or additional air changes within theatres, etc., and how the ward environments within the acute hospitals have had to be reconfigured. Next slide, please, Jane. So some of the key actions that we've taken to restore services has been the increase in the number of telephone and video appointments, recognising getting that balance right with that's not right for everybody or for every clinical environment. And we are continuing to access some independent hospital capacity until the end of March 2021. More at the NNN specifically, more 7-day working is in place, increased investment in robotic technology to use in robotic assisted surgeries, and an additional children's ward has been opened. Next slide, please. At the King's Lynn, Queen Elizabeth Hospital King's Lynn, some examples have been in reopening day surgery for elective work, and at the Paget, they've introduced additional diagnostic endoscopy clinics at the weekend and recommissioned an operating theatre that was previously closed. Next slide, please. Next set of actions that are being taken is extending endoscopy unit and provision, additional non-elective bed capacity in order to reduce the impact of non-elective demand, people occupying elective beds. The new interventional radiology unit opening this month, which is excellent because that's been a key risk actually over the last number of years. So that's a positive step forward. An increase in cath lab capacity for cardiac conditions. Queen Elizabeth introducing additional endoscopy capacity. Paget are looking to increase their diagnostic capacity. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see we're setting up a pilot of Protect now to use population health management to support people who are waiting for 52 weeks or more. Next slide, please. In terms of cancer care, the revised clinical guidelines for 2-week waits for suspected cancer patients has a more efficient pathway to improve utilisation of the our diagnostic services and conditions, and additional support for primary care to recover 2-week recovery rates to the pre-pandemic levels, and improving screening uptake and increased training. Next slide, please. Other measures, a range of measures in the pipeline, such as we've put ourselves forward to participate in the colon capsule endoscopy site, and we're waiting to hear on that. And other initiatives such as community cancer care to avoid people who are having chemotherapy and other treatments to have to necessarily come to the acute hospitals, and using our population health management approach to look at targeting local screening initiatives for hard to reach groups. Next slide, please. There's further options for recovery, including something that was announced last week. The Queen Elizabeth has acquired BMI Sandringham, and that is increasing their bed capacity by about 30 in order to help push forward on recovery of elective capacity, and looking to get as much impact as we can on the 111 first service during this autumn, in order to try and minimise avoidable non-elective demand, which can compromise elective recovery and cancer recovery. Next slide, please, Jane. The risks associated with the delivery of the restoration programme for elective and cancer include outbreaks of flu in the community, but obviously we are aiming to improve and enhance, and the next agenda item relates to our flu programme. Obviously there's a risk of a resurged peak of COVID, and also the challenges associated with the utilisation and efficiency within theatre because of infection prevention control measures that need to be put in place. There is pressure on our diagnostic capacity, And also we will likely see a continued resurgence in levels of referrals, particularly cancer referrals. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that we submitted our phase 3 plan to NHS England last week. And we're really working hard as a whole system to implement the changes that's needed in order to recover our elective and cancer care by delivering increased levels of activity. Next slide, please. In terms of workforce, staff who are redeployed are returning back to their day jobs, which is some of which is in regard to delivery of cancer and elective work. Also to note, our people plan that was launched, particularly our Norfolk and Waveney plan, which is a really exciting document, and I'd urge anybody to read it. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see we were selected as a pilot as part of a national campaign to implement a reservist programme, particularly to encourage people back into the NHS. And by giving flexibility to return, they would commit to working 20 days a year and complete training. It's very similar to the Armed Forces Reserve Service, and it's really an exciting way forward. And then to the next slide, please, Jane. And then in terms of addressing health inequalities, which is a huge priority for us now, everything we do, we're looking to see how we can address those inequalities that we're seeing in all aspects of our work. System leadership in this area is being provided by Caroline Shaw, who's the Chief Exec of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and the CCG lead for this is Melanie. We're looking at using population health management to try and address health inequalities. And the first example of this, or one of the examples of this, is our flu Protect Now approach, in order to try and target people who have in previous years not engaged with the flu vaccination programme despite being eligible. We've already heard about engagement with communities and hard to reach, and really pushing forward with that. And another good example is a live Facebook chat that members of our team held for people who live with learning disabilities, and that was a really exciting piece of work and a good way of engaging with people living with learning disabilities in order to understand the challenges that they face in terms of accessing services and being able to provide them with answers and support, and that will be repeated. And finally, it's about, as a system, working in partnership to help address health inequalities, and a good example of that was the learning from the Banham outbreak. I'll stop there, Chair, and happy for any questions.
Okay, thanks, Kath, for that comprehensive report, and particularly for struggling through with your voice. So do feel free to get a glass of water. I was really feeling for you then. So, any comments or questions from the governing body on Kath's report? Yep, John.
Thank you, Niamh. It's just a comment, really. So just to reflect, as Melanie mentioned in her report earlier, that there's a piece of work that's been done in parallel with this about the financial implications, I suppose, of all the things that Kath has outlined there in terms of elective recovery. So we're going through the process at the moment as a system of understanding, I think, the costings of that, which at the moment appears to be more than the funding that we've got as a system. So just to reflect the fact that, as is always the case, usually the case anyway, that we're trying to achieve as much as we possibly can within the financial envelope that we've got. So that's another potential barrier stroke risk, I suppose, to delivering some of the elective work.
Okay, thanks, John, and we would expect you to say that, so well done. Rob?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kath, for a very comprehensive presentation there. It's good to hear about all the good work that is being done and has been done. I just wanted to ask, are you encountering any barriers to moving to where we want to get to, or are there other things that we need to do, again, to get back to where we want to be?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think one of the barriers that's been experienced, recognising that actually as a whole system people are working very, very close, and I'll hand over to colleagues in a moment to expand on this. But one thing I think it's interesting to comment on is the infection prevention control national guidance that's been produced, and the level of social distancing, the 2 metre rule that's needed, is having an impact on the ability to have the level of productivity needed to recover the level of activity that's needed. And the really interesting debate to be had is by complying with one set of guidance and whether that adversely impacts on other clinical guidance. And so that's not something that specifically is a Norfolk and Waveney issue, but it's actually a real operational challenge, but also makes us need to question what priority is more important, and does COVID guidance overrule everything, or do we need to have a balanced approach with regard to cancer evidence and NICE guidance, etc. So I haven't got the answer, but I think it's really important that we recognise that the 2 metre rule and the infection prevention guidance is having an impact on the level of activity that we can get through our resources. Thank you.
Melanie, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Anoop. I was just going to say I would describe it more rather as a challenge than a barrier, in that people are exhausted from the first wave, and we're now saying to them, and now go again, to what is traditionally our busiest period of the year, the winter, and asking people to, winter is always, as we all know, incredibly challenging anyway, but having to manage those pressures, which will always involve lots of very, very long shifts and days and weekends for all staff as well, plus manage the uncertainty of COVID, getting everything back up as far as we can to where it was, and execute the biggest flu vaccination program that we've ever had. So I think those are the challenges we've got, which is why it's really important for us as leaders of the CCG, that we're showing leadership, really supporting our staff to do all that they can, and understanding the difficult circumstances that people are facing, particularly when society and so many families and people are struggling themselves. We are seeing perhaps just the level of tolerance perhaps changing, which is understandable, but we need to protect our staff as well, and make sure they are treated with respect from the population, who are inevitably undergoing very, very challenging times, as indeed are all of us. We are all patients at the same time.
No, I think those are really good, well-made points. Claire, do you want to come in?
Thank you. I mean, I would absolutely concur with everything that Melanie has just said. One of my questions or two things, a question and a comment. So one of the things that I've noticed is I think that along with the pre-existing national guidance, it has made clinicians in general really focus on risk stratification. And some of the tools that we have at our disposal with some of the projects we're doing, particularly through the Protect Now, really allows us to use a method of risk stratification to identify the people who obviously you can never identify everybody, but it allows us to identify cohorts who are likely to be more vulnerable and to put in proactive care. My guess would be that over the coming years we might see a shift in the way the NHS works in general. I've always considered the NHS to be largely a reactive service. I think risk stratification offers you an opportunity really to become a truly proactive service. And so one of the things that you mentioned is a good example of that. For example, introducing fit testing in the lower GI care pathway, which has another clinical measurement that allows us to risk stratify and prioritise the people who are at highest risk. So I think that's just an interesting observation. And my guess is we'll see that across a multitude of disease conditions over coming months and years. So my other concern is just on the back of all that. I think it's really fantastic to hear from many of our acute trust provider organisations about their ability to move to offer 7-day access, and I think that's very impressive. But I do worry a little bit about where that has come from. Have we been able to draft in additional staff to support that, or are we asking people to work more? Because I think it has been an incredibly hard year. It might be an incredibly hard winter, and I think that's both professionally, and obviously a lot of people have faced personal challenges as well as a consequence of the pandemic, if not in their own immediate family, perhaps with their wider families and friends. So just if there's anything more to share on that, I would be really interested to know a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments people would like to make? Yep, John?
Just a comment as well. There's clearly so much going on that Kath's focused on in those slides there, but also making the link to what we saw in the Britain Thinks feedback earlier. I think it's fair to say that absolutely as a system recognised the impact on people's mental health, and so the likely surge in mental health presentations is something that's very live in discussions as well. And I see that through the finance lens because that features highly in our finance discussions, but just to emphasise that there's a focus on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that too, that we need to learn from the experiences that patients have reported in the previous item as well. And I think goal is in getting the best out of our staff and our providers in uncertain situations. And I think, you know, one of my reflections is that one of the successes that we had was when we were dealing with very uncertain, quite frightening situations. I think we did go some way in allowing those at the front of the coalface to actually innovate and to do things differently and to move swiftly. And I think, you know, the winter, there's a lot of uncertainty around flu, second wave of COVID, and all the sort of the backlog that's accumulated. I think we must empower our staff to make decisions and to support them in those decisions, which are quite difficult, and they do take some risk. But it's really important that we support them in taking those risks on our behalf. Okay, well, I think that's a good discussion. So again, thanks, Kath, for that. And I'm sure it's you know, a lot of these things we'll be discussing as the months go on at future governing body meetings. So let's move on to item 9, which is we touched on flu, but some more detail on what the planning is around flu vaccines. And I think Karen, you're going to talk to this item. I hope. Is Karen here?
Karen, you're on mute.
Are you on mute, Karen?
She is here. I think she's trying to unmute it from what I can see.
Okay.
I can start, Chair, if that's okay.
Yep. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you. So the slides have just disappeared again. So I'll start talking as Jane puts the slides back up. But we are this year our flu programme has been planned to be bigger than ever, better than ever, and far more collaborative as a system. And there's some real priorities and focuses, as you'll see on the first few slides of the slide deck. And there's some exciting work in relation to what we're doing as part of our flu plan, including working with BAME groups and religious groups in order to develop multilingual vaccination programme. And I'll protect now. Karen, can you go on mute because your background noise is terrible? Thank you. Other areas of priority which I'll go through, working closely to support people who live with mental health, ill health as an area of focus, and also being better at knowing how we're doing in relation to our flu vaccination programme. So if you can go on to slide 4, please, Jane. And this gives some information about our Protect Now flu programme in terms of the target, as I said earlier, targeting people who have previously not engaged with uptake of a flu vaccination, despite being at the at-risk group. And it's really exciting that in a very short period of time, across 50 practices, 1,500 people were contacted, and of that, nearly 900 people have confirmed that they would have a vaccine following that interaction, which is really, really important and a great piece of work that's been achieved through Howard's leadership. Next slide, please. In terms of, as I say, we have taken this in a far more collegiate and productive way. We have set up a strategic flu cell across Norfolk and Waveney that's had a number of meetings, which is attended on a very wide level, including people representing the care providers, the LMC, the LPC, the acute, the hospitals, mental health trusts, etc., along with a real focus on primary care. And you'll see on this slide the focus and the work that's being done, and particularly at the bottom of that slide, we're really working hard on getting much more partnership working between primary care and community pharmacists, so they're working together rather than in competition for delivery of flu vaccines. Next slide, please. In terms of that community pharmacy aspect, the way in which they work together, including making sure that the pharmacy community pharmacy services provide that information to the practices to make sure that the clinical records are updated. And as I say, it's about that. There's also the pharmacy quality service incentive that's been set up by NHS England, which does incentivise the collaboration with the PCN levels with community pharmacists. Next slide, please. So we have a really comprehensive flu plan, which has been commended at region, with feedback from them to say that the Norfolk and Waveney approach and the plan is one from which many other areas can learn and take note of. One thing that's really important to mention is relating to working with practices to develop robust business continuity plans and putting budgeting arrangements in place. That was focusing initially on what would happen in the event of any local lockdowns, but an area of note that we are picking up has been concerns about the vaccines that have been stored in fridges, where some practices have experienced power cuts, and that's compromising the vaccine integrity. So we're working on how business continuity and partnership working can support this to make sure that our practice populations aren't compromised as a result of a lack of access to vaccines. Next slide, please. This slide has been updated from the version that went out with the papers last week with a bit more specific detail. So we've done some work in relation to understanding the scale of our flu programme. And what you'll see is the sub-bullet points setting out the scale of the population that fall into the categories of eligible individuals. So you can see for people who are under the age of 65 but have long-term conditions that make them eligible, there's 115,000 of our population, and that's a group that we are aspiring to achieve in excess of 75% uptake. And again, without going through all of those lines, you'll see the scale, the numbers of people we're talking about, and our ambitions to achieve the required at a minimum amount of eligible vaccinations. What we don't know yet is the impact of COVID and how that will encourage people who don't fit into the eligible criteria to seek out a flu vaccine, which in some respects is positive, but the concern will be relating to the use of the vaccine, available vaccine, which needs to be prioritised for those that are at clinical risk. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Jane. So in terms of the next steps, Next, risk and constraints. So there are risks to the delivery of the programme, which may be relating to workforce constraints, but also if people are displaying some symptoms and any testing limitations regarding the COVID service could compromise the workforce to be able to deliver the vaccines, but also really important to comment on the stock availability. Just for clarity, the Norfolk and Waitwell Every system was asked back in February to submit the numbers of flu vaccines that both whether it be the large providers or the GP practices or the community pharmacies, that the numbers that they would want to order. But obviously things have changed significantly, and we know that NHS England have procured a significantly increased number of vaccines, but we are needing to work to the challenges associated with accessing those vaccines. So that is a key risk that we need to keep an eye on. And the other thing is that it's really important that the concept of making every contact counts is applied. So, for example, if pregnant women are being seen in antenatal clinics, it would be really good if they could be vaccinated at the same time. But that wasn't planned for. But also for acute hospitals, for example, to vaccinate their inpatients, they're likely to be of the over 65 type, and they were unlikely to have ordered that many. So there's real vaccine challenges that we need to make sure they're made available to those areas. And finally, the public expectation of access to flu vaccine may be at odds with the reality of being able to provide it at a time that meets people's expectations. So when the announcement was made a few weeks ago that people within the 50 to 64 age range who do not have the long-term condition eligibility could receive a flu vaccine, that increased expectation which can't be met until we know there is sufficient vaccine available. So the practices in particular and community pharmacies are having to deal with that, the balance of demand versus availability. I'll stop there, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Kath, for going through that report on flu campaign for this year. Any questions or comments from the governing body? Yeah, Hilary? Oh, and Tracy after that.
Thanks, Steve. I was just going to ask Kath, that centrally held pool of vaccines that NHS England are going to have, do we have any ideas yet about how we will be able to access those and on what basis and how they'll be distributed nationally? That's the first bit of my question, but it kind of links onto the second bit, which was, if you believe the news, you hear that community pharmacies are saying to people that they haven't got enough vaccines to vaccinate people even now, when the flu campaign is really just only getting up and running. So how are we going to manage the communication out to our people around when they can access vaccines in order to take the pressure off frontline services who are, you know, trying to deliver something really that's never been delivered on the same scale before?
Thanks, Hilary. So in terms of access to the additional vaccines, we're keeping a very close eye on that, and Lois Taylor from our Meds Optimisation team is involved in overseeing the supply and demand in dialogue with NHS England. So we've got people whose job is focusing on the flu vaccine availability. So I'll make sure that we go back and add into the FAQs how people can access the direct information about accessibility of the vaccines if they're running short, including community pharmacies. And in terms of our comms plan, we've got a very comprehensive comms plan. I will take back an action to ensure that it's dynamic in the sense of it enables, whether it be daily, weekly, whatever is needed, updates to the population and our partners, community pharmacists, to be able to keep people informed as to the challenges we've got and when to focus, what feedback to give to people who are seeking flu vaccines, rather than just saying we're out of stock, we haven't got any, because that doesn't inspire confidence in our population. So I think we need to be a bit more informative, if at all possible, in the information that we provide to our colleagues and our population.
Okay, Tracy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, my question was similar to Hillary's. It's about those additional stocks and being able to get hold of those really, and understanding what we will have available to us. So I've sort of heard some comments anecdotally from some practices that they think they'll have enough stock for the majority of patients, but also they think they might have enough staff for their frontline staff, but actually admin, support worker staff, they will not have enough when we're talking about our primary care staff vaccinations. And I have another concern with some of our, depending on how we order our vaccines and put all the things the previous year, that we might not have enough for some of our more vulnerable transient homeless groups around Norfolk and Waveney, and that some of our services such as Mental Health Trust and CGL, we're asking them to help vaccinate, but we're not sure that they've got vaccine supplies. So again, it's drawing on that pool of vaccines and knowing what is our Norfolk and Waveney part of that, really.
Okay, thank you. Melanie, were you wanting to come in? Did I see you?
Yes, please. I mean, I think just in response to Hilary and Tracy's questions are really important, and we will take that away, just as Kath said, to be absolutely clear what's the premise for the national stockpile and how practices can access that. I wanted to just mention a little bit about how this is being managed by the region, and there is a very hefty machinery around our flu vaccination programme, even the bits that we're involved in, but there's quite a lot of regional coordination, which again stems from the national team. And this is very, very different to previous years. So because of the scale of the programme and the requirement to really carefully ensure that supplies flow, we are members of a regional vaccination board that NHS England have stood up, and so we can flag this through that route. I wanted to just mention a couple of other points, which is the comms campaign, and we always do lots of communications to encourage people to come forward for their flu vaccinations, but with this year we have started much earlier, partly because we know that people have been coming forward to practices and through other forum just to ask for their vaccination. And this is particularly in the new age group, the new cohort, the 50 to 64-year-old, which is new. And government announced that this cohort would be eligible for vaccination probably before practices will have called them. So people wouldn't be expecting to be called. But we know this has created quite a bit of confusion in the general population, and that cohort will be called last, which is entirely in line with their clinical priority and what we would be supporting practices to do. Having said that, I've been really delighted to hear some of the reports from general practices about how they're managing to find different ways to vaccinate their population using larger venues or different approaches. It's been really great to hear how well this is going in general practice in many areas, because practices are too small for some in some practices for people to be seen in a clinic as they traditionally would have done. So again, practices have had to come up with different ways, and I'm really pleased that we've had very positive reports of that, and greater numbers of people being able to be vaccinated in one clinic than was previously estimated.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Arden, did you want to ask a question? I think we're going to need to wrap up in a couple of minutes on this item, but Arden, and I think Mark Burgess, you wanted to add as well. So Arden first.
Thank you, Anoop. It was really, my question was really around that anticipated additional cohort and this identifying the centralised location for that. I think, as Melanie drew attention to, I think this is something that patients will be really keen to learn much more about. And there's already quite a lot of interest from those additional cohorts about how they might receive the vaccine. And going forward, what an exciting way to start delivering the flu vaccine if we can identify some locations for across our county that has to be the way forward for delivering flu vaccinations in the future for the majority, so that we can practice can then perhaps target the more vulnerable and the harder to reach.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I mean, in terms of the sequencing, I was briefed last week because I did an interview for Radio Norfolk that for the group 50 to 65, that they're going to be started from November onwards. That's right, isn't it? So I think that's one of the key messages to be giving to that cohort, which is what we're certainly doing in our practice. Mark?
Thank you, Chair. And conscious of time, I'll be very brief. Just to say that actually, also the practices, we have quite a good idea of the stock held and ordered by practices. So practices are also working with us to share. For example, one practice lost its stock of flu, and other neighbouring practices in the PCN have helped. So we've seen some really good working across the patch around supply of vaccine as well, which is very pleasing to note.
Good. I think that's a good place to end on that item. So thank you for that update. Let's move to the next item, which is 10, and an update for Melanie on the integrated care system project and development.
Thank you. Again, we've got some slides, which I'm just going to really pull out some of the key points, because I think we've had quite slide presentations just recently, whilst Karen is, I think, sharing those. Yeah, so just to summarise, Norfolk and Waveney is delighted to have been invited to express an interest in becoming an integrated care system in the autumn. This is, of course, national policy, so every one of the 41 systems in England will be will have an integrated care system arrangement in place by April 21. So we're just going 6 months earlier. We're very pleased about that. We're still working to the current legislation, so it does not mean any organisational change. It just means that we are formalising our partnership and our system approach and operating in line with the principles of an integrated care system. And the slides that I'm sharing today are a summary of a presentation that I'll be giving at the Norfolk Health and Wellbeing Board in a couple of weeks. And governing body members will also be invited to a specific dedicated session after the governing body to be able to spend more time on the expression of interest that we're making. So many of these slides people will have already seen, because a lot of it features in our long-term plan and the principles and the values and aims and objectives for Norfolk and Waveney. So on to the next slide, please, Karen. The principles are set out there, which I won't go through. Again, those are very much were part of our long-term plan. And, it's working together in collaboration with a common purpose really is at the heart of our approach. What's important about the integrated care system, or the ICS, just as we're working now as a partnership, we operate in planning and delivery terms at 3 levels. Neighbourhoods, and we have 17 neighbourhoods or primary care networks in Norfolk and Waveney. Places, which are groups of where people naturally live, so we can plan and deliver services that are common as far as we possibly can to the needs of those populations. And the level is very much where integration and transformation has really accelerated over the last 6 months, and involves many other partners, not just the NHS and care sector, but certainly district councils and voluntary sector as well. On to the next slide, please, Karen. I'm going to show the map, which just illustrates the point. So this map here, which you might want to take some time to study after the meeting, sets out our 17 primary care networks, neighbourhoods, and then the darker lines show the 8 district or borough councils in black across Norfolk and Waveney. And these are important, just some of the groupings where people live in Norfolk and Waveney, where we might need to have more integrated and different approaches to planning and delivery of services because of the different demographics in each of these systems. So on to the next one, please. I'm going to say just a little bit more, as I said earlier, about the integration at locality or place level, which is important in an integrated care system. On to the next one again, please. This slide again is from the King's Fund, a piece of work which has been carried out to really focus on what are the most important drivers and things to do at that place, local level. So we will be working through with partners, with primary care networks, district councils and voluntary sector to develop our approach and be clear on our approach for that locality area. Our primary care networks, the 17, have formed and continue to grow and thrive. And similarly at system level, we have integration across Norfolk and Waveney, which again is fairly well defined, particularly now through having one CCG and one commissioning organisation. And so on to the final slide, a key element of having an integrated care system will be having a partnership board. And work has taken place over the last few months around developing our partnership board and what that should look like. Every ICS has to have a partnership board. It needs to be a manageable size. And these are some of the issues that we have considered and will propose for the Norfolk and Waveney Partnership Board, which will hold its meetings in public, even though it's not a statutory board, it's a partnership board still, bringing together partners to reach consensus on issues where we can only have one approach and one strategic approach across Norfolk and Waveney. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie, for that update. Any comments or questions? I can see you also. You can raise your hand if you like. Or not. Okay, so you've answered all their questions without them asking them, Melanie. Well done. So if there aren't any questions, let's move to item 11 then, which is the annual report for 1920 on learning disability mortality. Kath, you want to talk to that? Yep, thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you. So everybody will have seen the background paper, the cover paper for the leader review. So just a little bit of information that you'll see set out. There is a national learning disabilities mortality review programme, which has been in place now for the last 3 years, which sets out a clear requirement for people who have a learning disability and die for their death, for their care to be reviewed. And it's really important to recognise that people with a learning disability, the evidence says that they die younger than people who do not have a learning disability. And the life expectancy difference is around 50 to 20 years. So it is absolutely significant, and it's really important that this is an area that we all focus on as a priority improvement. So the cover paper sets out a summary of the leader report, which shows the level of local activity that's been in place with regard to this. So since April 2017, 170 adult deaths and 5 children, young people deaths have been notified to the leader system for review at a local level. And what the evidence is showing us so far of those deaths that have been reviewed, that the median death age at death is 62 in Norfolk and Waveney, compared with the average in England of 61. local action is being taken as a result of the reviews that are taking place to ensure that it doesn't become a transactional process, but actually informs improvements, in quality improvements. There is a learning disability mortality review steering group that takes place within the local system. It's chaired by Sarah Jane Ward, who's one of our associate directors, and focuses on quality and care. But what's really important is that it's co-chaired by a gentleman called Andrew Borrett, who's an expert by lived experience, and you'll see set out in pages 4 and 5 of the report a written account about why this is so important and what Andrew has been able to contribute to improvements in this area. Themes that are identified from our local reviews for people with a clinical background, they will unlikely be of a surprise, and particular areas such as the application and correct use of the Mental Capacity Act, and putting in place reasonable adjustments to enable people with learning disabilities to be able to access services, including cancer screening. Other themes include multi-agency working or a need to improve that in that area, and of course end-of-life planning. The improvements that have been achieved to date include improving bowel care and reducing constipation, which is a leading contributor to mortality and morbidity for people with learning disabilities, also reducing the risk of pneumonia, reducing the risk of something called dysphagia, which is when people can't swallow effectively. And we've identified some priorities for 2021, which include us continuing to address the backlog of reviews that need to be undertaken. We're piloting some bowel care guidance in some of the care homes that care for people with living with learning disabilities, and improving access to annual health checks and improving health plans, amongst others. And finally, I just would like to commend the what I consider to be an excellent easy read version of the leader report that's being published. This is about learning disabilities, and it's people with learning disabilities, and it's important that people who do live with learning disabilities have access to this document in a way in which they are more able to use and understand. And I think that's an excellent piece of work that our comms and engagement team has undertaken in partnership with Sarah Jane and her team, to really bring to life for people with learning disabilities the findings of the leader review. I'll stop there, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much for Catherine. And I agree, it was really good to send the easy read version with the papers. I think that demonstrates the value of this work. Any comments? Yep, Rob, did you want to ask a question? And then Tracy.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kath. I think it's a very important area for us for all of the reasons that you mentioned. I had 2 questions on the report. Firstly, there's a reference to a backlog of reviews, and I wonder if there's anything more that we can do to help clear that backlog. And then secondly, the report also rightly refers to the annual health checks for people with learning disabilities. And I wanted to know where we're monitoring our performance against the national target for those annual health checks. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of clearing the backlog, we are taking decisions to access clinical input to undertake the reviews. So we have a wide number of our clinical team and people who work outside of the CCG undertaking those reviews. And I'm confident that, subject to any COVID challenges outside of our control, we will address the backlog and get that so that we are able to, in a much more timely manner, review the deaths, because that's much more meaningful for the families of people with learning disabilities that have died. That it doesn't seem, we don't want it happening 18 months after the death. We want it to be happening in a far more timely approach. So we're being really flexible with our workforce and drawing in additional resource as needed, and we have budget for that, which is positive. And then in terms of annual health checks, the challenge is that that's an area of clinical practice that stopped predominantly during the COVID period. So there is a change in we're having to recover the position on that. So at the moment, there's work underway to understand where we are in terms of completion, the proportion of people that have had an annual health check completed, and how we can work to improve that area by the end of the financial year. But what we've also done is been fortunate to secure, we've been identified as an exemplar site in this area, and we're going to use the modest amount of money that we've been awarded by NHS England to particularly focus on people with learning disabilities that are in that hard to reach group, and people with a BAME background. So to do some exciting innovative work on how as a system, rather than just relying on the individual practices, but working to support the practices to do over and above than we've ever done, to be able to access, to help people living with a learning disability to access those services. So I think that this is an area where in another month or two, and Parveen Mercer is leading on this, we'll be able to present a clear position in terms of our performance, where we are, what the revised trajectory is for completion, which has been adjusted by NHS England, and what we're doing in order to achieve that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just on that, I know the guidance was sent to practices to give some thought as to within the current pandemic, what those annual health checks, what they were doing in the context of not being able to provide those services in a normal face-to-face way. That actually it's really important to appropriately still have access to services for that very vulnerable group. Particularly, the pandemic creates, I think, extra challenges in reaching out to those patients. Tracy, do you want to comment?
Yeah, there's also what Catherine said, really. It's easier about that additional time and funding support to, support access people and actually make some of those adjustments so they wouldn't just access this.
Is it just me, or is there a lot of interference?
Is that sensible talking now?
No, it's really difficult.
You sound like a Derek.
I don't know why.
I think I heard you saying about reasonable adjustments.
I did, and it was about the money that you have secured in order to do that. So this is something about the learning of the reviews and sharing that system-wide. So it's the we can learn in primary care as well as second care, community care throughout. Sorry, I'll probably stand all for a moment.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And we talked last week at the Quality and Performance Committee about how we can be more effective in making sure that the learning is made much more widely available across the system. Otherwise, you could argue what's the point of doing the reviews. And in terms of the, I think what I heard was you say in relation to the hard to reach category groups of people, and how we can do that more effectively, and that will be what we're working through now in order to make that happen. But that's an area of focus that we benefit from working at a greater scale, which is quite exciting in that area.
Okay, thanks. We're just mindful of time, but I'm going to ask Arden and Claire to make some comments. You could make comments one after the other, and then Kath can respond.
I was pretty much going to say what you said, Anoop, that learning disabilities is an area that's been highlighted as one of the priorities as we stand up QoF. The element of QoF that has to be completed regardless of the pandemic. So that's actually really good news in this regard.
Okay. And Arden, did you want to come in?
Just to comment that we have an opportunity at the moment with the new PCN DES, which links practices with the homes with learning disabilities in order to ensure that respect forms are completed, so that more people are able to die in their own home environments, but also to start the Restore 2 training, which I think is really vital in managing people who are deteriorating, which of course could be rolled out fairly rapidly, I would have thought.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. Kathy, do you want to come back on that or no?
Thank you. I think they're just really important points. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thanks very much for that and for giving us that report as well. We're doing fine for time. So welcome to Mark Lim, who's going to talk about the next item, which is around Achilles tendinopathy, which we did look at in July, and we asked the policy group to kind of look at what was being recommended, didn't we, Mark?
Thanks, Nick. So the main gist of the discussion last time was whether or not a 12-month waiting period would be too long for particularly patients who had some job which may be affected by having Achilles tendinopathy. So as discussed last time, we've sought feedback both from the clinical policies group and from the specialists who help inform the policy in the first place. And the view of the specialists was that for the majority of patients, they would not operate in any case. So these are the patients with non-insertional Achilles tendinopathy. So for those not familiar with the term, it's for those where the condition exists slightly further away from the heel bone. However, the surgeon said that they would like to potentially see patients where the disease is closer to the heel bone, i.e. insertional Achilles tendinopathy sooner. So we've made 2 changes to the document. First of all, just to make that distinction that the 12-month rule applies specifically to patients with non-insertional Achilles tendinopathy, and obviously secondly to remove insertional Achilles tendinopathy from restriction. So hopefully that's clear, and hopefully governing bodies will be able to approve. Thank you. Sorry, Nick, you're on mute.
Thank you. So any comments from governing body before we ask to approve? In particular, I can't remember who it was who asked for us. Was it you, Claire? You put your hand.
It was me. So it was effectively drawing attention to that difference between insertional and non-insertional Achilles tendinopathy. So I'm very happy with the changes.
Okay, so assuming that they're all still, the others are still happy as well, can I ask you then to approve the revised guidance on Achilles tendinopathy? Yep. Okay, that's unanimous nods there, so that's unanimous. Okay, so let's move to item 13, which is recommendations from the Drugs and Therapeutic Committee. And Kath, that's got your name next to it.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. So I wasn't planning to go through it in detail. The covering paper has set out a summary of the recommendations made by the Drug and Therapeutic Committee last month. Those recommendations are clearly made, and we're asking for governing body to approve those clinical recommendations.
Okay. Thank you. And as usual, we should say that it is for the governing body to make these decisions. But as with threshold policies, decisions that are made on therapeutics do come before the clinical executive for comment, and I think these did come to the clinical executive as well. So, but any questions from governing body on what we're being asked to approve? Yep, John.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question, Kath. On the third page of the document that's there with the recommendations, it talks about new SC formulations of infliximab and vedolizumab during COVID. In the recommendation, it mentions cost issues being relevant, but nowhere in the paper does it give an indication of what those cost issues might be and the scale of them. So I was just wondering if we know actually whether there's any kind of material financial impact of any of these recommendations. They don't appear to be from all the other recommendations. That's the only one that felt like it might have.
No, I don't know that, John. So if the governing body thinks it's a good idea, what we can do is take that information away and provide that offline to governing body to inform the decision about that specific item.
What do you feel, John? Do you feel that it could be of a magnitude where that might be a significant thing to look into before we approve?
I don't get the sense it is, but I suppose I think it'll be helpful when it comes to the governing body, just so we can make that rounded decision. Yeah. Just be aware, just in case, because sometimes obviously new drugs, new uses come through that can have quite significant financial implications. I'm not aware that this one does, but
okay. So I mean, would it be sensible perhaps for us to approve, but with that particular one, just with a proviso that we just need that information, which perhaps if you could have, John, and then we, under chair's action, we can then approve if you're happy with the information that you're given.
That would be great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Lovely.
Yep. So on that basis, can governing body approve the recommendations that have been made? Yep. Okay. So great. Thank you. So let's move on to the item 14, which is the finance report from John.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So just a brief introduction. The report's there. Hopefully people have had a chance to read it. So it's the report as at the end of August, 5 months into the financial year. Just a brief reminder of the very unusual financial regime we're in this year. Any normal approach and our previously notified allocations were swept aside at the start of the year because of the COVID pandemic. And it was replaced with a nationally calculated approach to CCG funding based on what we'd spent last year. And the regime was then that for each CCG and for each provider organisation, at the end of each month, we apply for top-up funding to balance off so that all organisations can break even. We also apply for retrospective funding for any COVID-related costs that we've incurred in each period. So that's the environment that we're in at the moment. So it's not unusual for us to be reporting £13 million gap at the end of month 5, given that 11 million of that relates to top-up funding that we're expecting to receive. I checked earlier, we haven't received it yet, but it's normal that we would receive it the last working day of the month. So I would hope that tomorrow or perhaps the following day, we'll have confirmation that we've received that funding. The other £2 million part of the gap is related to the delivery of the mental health investment standard and just understanding how the financial transactions are working with this different financial framework. Again, we're working that through with the Mental Health Trust and with NHS England and Improvement, and that's a technicality that will be addressed. So there is a gap, but it's not a gap for us to worry about as at month 5. It's worth noting as well, in terms of those claims that we make for COVID-related spend, after 5 months of the year, we've incurred and claimed reimbursement for around £30 million worth of COVID-related spend, half of which has gone on the hospital discharge programme, whereby since the middle of March, any patient discharged from hospital is placed in an appropriate setting and the cost of that falls on the NHS. There's been no continuing healthcare or other assessment. That's changed from the 1st of September, so a different regime is in place going forwards. The report also identifies a number of risks that have been identified within the financial situation for the CCG and identifies how they're being managed. The other thing I was going to mention was just to allude a bit more to what we've mentioned a couple of times already during the meeting about the new financial framework that's coming in for the remaining 6 months of this year. So on the 15th of September, we had financial envelopes and accompanying guidance published, since which time as a system and as individual organisations we've been working it through, understanding what it means for our positions, trying to resolve any outstanding questions, and there's still guidance coming through. Indeed, this morning we received quite a lot of extra information about additional specific programme funding that's due to the system that we're trying to understand over the next couple of days. So we're working through that to make a further submission to the regional team next Monday. And this will result in a revised financial plan for the CCG, in which, as noted in the action log earlier in the meeting, will bring back to a future meeting of the governing body for approval. That's all I was going to say by way of introduction. All of these issues were discussed at the Finance Committee on the 15th of September, as noted, I think, in Hein's report later on as chair of the Finance Committee, but I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, John. Any questions for John on his finance report? Kath, is that you? No, that's not you waving, is it? No. Okay, just checking. Okay, great. Thank you. So let's move to item 15. And Karen, you're going to go through the GBAF and the risks, the risk register.
Yes, that's correct. I'll keep it brief there. I just wanted to give the governing body a quick appraisal of where we are in getting our risk management process set up. You'll recall from last time you approved a governing body assurance, an actual framework around how we work with our risk management. We are partway now through getting that process set up. We've got team registers now established, and in the next coming month or so, we're hoping to fully implement the process whereby the team registers feed up ultimately to EMT and a bit of a review process, and then you will have your governing body assurance framework risks from there. So just to remind you all, the governing body assurance framework is the top risks, the top things that the organisation is concerned about to bring to the governing body's attention. We thought because of the pandemic, it has been a while since we've been able to bring that to you. So although we're partway through implementing the process, we thought it would be useful now for EMT to actually have a bit of a conversation about what risks were pertinent to the organisation. So EMT, whereby I mean Melanie and her direct reports, the directors, have reviewed and discussed the GBAF governing body assurance framework, which you have with your papers, and identified the risks set out there. So I don't propose potentially to go through those in any detail, but obviously if there are questions, then we do have I think nearly all of the directors, I think actually all of the directors here who are responsible for different elements of the risks. So between us all, we'll be able to answer any questions on the specific risks. I think the final thing to say is that the governing body, as you'll know, are working on, along with the exec team, the strategic objectives for the organisation. So once they are established, we will then cross-check that with the risks that are identified, and we would hope to be a very strong correlation there, but obviously if there isn't, we would let you know about that. So that's all I wanted to say about the paper. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you. And I think Rob wants to make a comment.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And these are comments for Karen, I think, to think about in the next iteration rather than respond to today. And the Audit Committee, as Karen knows, will be looking at the assurance framework at its meeting next month. I think what I'd make a plea for, Karen, is that we just need to avoid overcomplicating matters and creating too much bureaucracy. Otherwise, there's a real risk that it will detract from what the purpose of the risk management and approach is. There were a number of risks in John's finance paper, including the efficiency challenge and EU exit. And that made me wonder whether those should feature on the governing body assurance framework. And that then leads to the question of how do risks move between individual risk registers and the governing body assurance framework. We haven't scored the risk, and you know, there might be a debate to have as to whether scoring is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think it's important that if we don't score them, we prioritise the risks in some way. And then I think just picking up on your last comment about strategic objectives, the strategic objectives should be the starting point for the assurance framework, because it's the risks that we face that will prevent us from achieving those strategic objectives. which are the ones that we need to be addressing. So, I'll just leave those as comments for you to think about, as I say, in the next iteration. Thank you.
I can just make one comment back, if I may, Chair, just on that. Just on the scoring, I should have said in my presentation that we were very keen to highlight the risk to the governing body this time, but because we haven't finished the process, that's why they're not scored yet. But it is our intention in the final version of GBAF2 to do the scoring. So there hasn't been a conscious decision not to do the scoring. That will be forthcoming when we finish the process. And your other points I can pick up separately as we go through audit and other forums. Thanks.
Okay, and have we got any other comments on the framework or specifically the risks that have been identified? I mean, a lot of them are what we've kind of been discussing today, really. So I hope it does seem to people that we've got the right items on there. Any comments we want to make in terms of the risk register and what we're doing to mitigate those risks? Doris?
Just more of a general comment. I mean, I think it's, given where we are in terms of the process, I think it's good to see a summary of the sort of the things that are causing concern. And obviously it's work in progress. So I'm very much want to thank Karen and her team for actually getting us to this place, because it's been a long drawn out process and more work to do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. I haven't got anybody else coming in for comments, so we'll leave that item there. Thank you. So we're on to the kind of final section now, which is the reports from the committees, updates. And first we've got item 16 from Quality and Performance Committee from Kathy.
Thank you, Chair. This is a verbal report of the Quality and Performance Committee, as we only met on Thursday, but we intend to bring a written report to future governing body meetings. The Quality and Performance Committees met on 3 occasions now, and at the last meeting we approved a number of documents, including the complaints policy and also the leader policy, which the government leader report, which the governing body has just considered. We also noted a number of reports on system quality and performance. And the thing that I want to draw to your attention is that we've made a commitment as a committee that when we look at issues of quality and performance, we're going to consider the implications for the people who live in Norfolk and Waveney. And we're going to have a real focus on patient and public involvement and also patient stories, which is beginning to give us a different way of looking at those issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Kathy? And so, Finance Committee, Hein?
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it short. We were fortunate that the Finance Committee met 2 weeks before, so a written report was possible. I think it dovetails well with what John spoke to earlier. Just wanted to highlight that there is a lot of work ongoing with the emerging financial plan for month 7 to 12 that John briefly spoke to, and that is coming back to both the Finance Committee and then the governing body. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Doris from the Primary Care Committee.
Thank you, Chair. There's a summary paper which is popping up for, this is the first report we've given to governing body since the Primary Care Committee restarted. I will just take it as read. Obviously, quite a lot of things have been through the Primary Care Committee for approval and services set up.
Okay, so we're up to note that report.
Yes, please.
Right, great, thank you. So item 19 is questions from the public, and I think we've had 3 questions which have come before this meeting, and I think we've got some slides, haven't we, which we can put up to show the questions, and some of them we're able to answer today. Yeah, so that's a question around Fairstead surgery.
I can say, Chair, that the first two questions have been answered and the reply sent to the inquirer. The information has also been put on our website for the public to read. The third question we only received yesterday afternoon, so we have put that on the final slide, and I'll put that through in a second. But they have, we will answer that shortly, and again, the answer will be on our website.
Okay, great. So I think just for it'd be useful just to be able to see them so that those people kind of online can see what the questions were. That'd be quite helpful.
I'll just scroll through them for the YouTube live streaming, but anyone who is watching can also find them on our website if I'm going too quickly.
Okay.
This is the final question that we will be responding to shortly.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for that. So I think we're slightly ahead of time, which is good. And it's we're on to any other business. So I can't see anybody now. Suddenly it's got. Oh, there we are. Any other business? No? Okay, well, that's great. In that case, I'll close this part of the meeting. And a reminder that our next meeting in public is on the 24th of November at 1:30. I think realistically, we can assume that it will still be online. And if we can make it more accessible, we will. But I can't see us meeting face-to-face in public over the winter months. So I'll close the meeting there.